BBC World Service. A weekly programme, our job is to add in-depth analysis to one big question from the news. We hope you like it.
BBC World Service. This is Tessa Dunlop with The Inquiry. This week, with President Obama threatening to bypass Congress to get his agenda through, we ask, is American democracy broken? On the evening of November the 20th, President Obama stepped onto a plush red carpet at the end of a White House corridor.
My fellow Americans, tonight I'd like to talk with you about immigration. For more than
He talked for 15 minutes, admitting that the system he vowed to fix as a candidate almost 6 years ago remains broken. With time running out on his presidency, he promised to bring change through executive action.
To those members of Congress who question my authority to make our immigration system work better, or question the wisdom of me acting where Congress has failed, I have one answer. Pass a bill.
A dig at his Republican critics who control the House of Representatives. They failed to pass a bill last year that would have reformed immigration. But that night, after Mr. Obama finished speaking, the Republican leader in the House had his own harsh words for the president.
That's just not how our democracy works. The president had said before that he's not king, and he's not an emperor, but he's sure acting like one.
With Republicans now in control in both the House and the Senate, and some even threatening to impeach the president over the issue, the risk of continued political paralysis in Washington is very real.
This is what democracy looks like! Show them what democracy looks like! This is what democracy looks like!
The public are angry and fed up. Turnout at the recent midterm elections hit a 72-year low. So this week, The Inquiry asks, is American democracy broken?
Part 1. The Dysfunction.
There are three branches of the US government: the legislative, Congress, the executive, which is the presidential office, and the judicial, in the form of the courts. These separate powers were designed by the Founding Fathers to be a check on each other so that no individual branch would assume too much power. But as we've just heard, some Republicans believe the president has overstepped his mark and acted undemocratically by unilaterally passing immigration reform. Our first witness on the inquiry believes the other branches have deep fissures too.
Democracy needs a very large tweak. Sometimes when my 4-year-old children are acting naughty, shake your finger at them and you say, just cut it out. And that's kind of what democracy needs right now. It needs a very big finger wag and a very stern, cut it out.
Jennifer Bevan-Dangle is the Executive Director of Common Cause Maryland. Her mission is to be the people's voice in the political process.
It is frustrating to see where the democracy is at right now in America, although we certainly have our roller coaster, as every government does. But right now the gridlock is the most obvious symptom of the problem we're having. And so much of it is caused by the polarization of our parties.
The first thing Jennifer Bevan-Dangle is keen to tackle is the system by which representatives are elected to the House. Political parties in the United States gerrymander. In other words, they can redraw electoral boundaries, often in very odd shapes, to help their candidates and hurt their opponents.
Maryland is home to one of the most gerrymandered districts in the nation. In Common Cause Maryland, we actually led an effort to run around this district with a team of a dozen runners. And it took us 3 days, what you should have been able to get across in 4 hours, because it just stretched from north of Baltimore down to Annapolis and then almost all the way over to Washington, D.C. It's interesting because even though some of these districts can wind through an amazing amount of physical space, they just connect people who are very similar in their ideology. And that's harmful for any democracy. I can't tell you how many people say to me, oh, I just didn't vote because my vote doesn't matter.
And it's not just the House of Representatives our witness is putting on the naughty step. The Senate is also exploiting loopholes within the Constitution.
Most rules that come out of the Senate are supposed to be a simple majority, so 51 votes should pass a law. But because of procedural rules dealing with the filibuster, well, it takes 60 votes to cut off debate.
Last year, because of the lack of cooperation between the parties, a new rule was introduced in the Senate to stop politicians talking out or filibustering each other's bills, a practice that has increased in recent years. But the change abandons the idea of a simple majority.
And we're seeing that impact on many, many common sense reforms that simply can't get through this logjam.
People who have been pushing for new gun laws to curb gun violence just suffered a big blow. And the bipartisan compromise to expand background checks on guns just failed to break a Republican filibuster. The vote was 54 to 40.
Very famously, some gun ownership reforms, which have 90% support when you do polling of the American public, could not make it through the Senate because they could not pass that 60-vote threshold.
So what about the branch of government that's meant to be independent and above partisanship, the judiciary?
The judiciary has always been seen as this third party immune to political pressures, immune to special interest pressures, and the trust in that body is what's so important. Lately, unfortunately, we are seeing a little bit of a shift in that trust. Some of our judicial seats are elected, and the campaign finance problems that are hitting our state and federal legislators, those campaign finance problems are also hitting our judges, unfortunately. There was a few studies done in the last few years that showed how campaign contributions do impact judicial decisions, which is very troubling. And at the Supreme Court level, we've seen some of our Supreme Court justices speaking at events funded by one special interest or another, and it raises that question of the impartiality of that body.
For Jennifer Bevan-Dangle, the paralysis of the United States legislative branches, combined with what she perceives to be a tainted judiciary, has had a profound impact on the country's political identity.
I think the crisis of democracy is still coming from the fact that too many people are checked out. Too many people either feel that it is hopeless or they feel that no one will listen to them. We haven't gotten to that point where enough people feel so personally affected that they're engaging in a deeper way. But throughout our history, whenever we have made that shift where that middle-class, average American suddenly starts to feel angry and feel like I have to be heard, that's when things do change.
Our first witness believes only a galvanised middle class can deliver that change. But what if the game is rigged before Jennifer Bevan-Dangle's angry voters even get to the polls? Our next witness thinks the vested interests behind the scenes in American politics are where the real problems lie.
Part 2. The money and the power.
Well, right now I'm teaching a seminar at Northwestern University. It's all seniors. There's about 15 students in the class, and the title of the course is Oligarchs and Elites.
Our second witness is Jeffrey Winters, a professor of politics at Northwestern University in Connecticut. Earlier this year, an academic study conducted by Princeton and Northwestern universities concluded what many suspected, that the preferences of rich people had a disproportionate sway on American policy decisions.
I'll just tell you, interestingly, over the years I've taught this, students, say 5-6 years ago, were resistant to the idea that oligarchs were really powerful and that there was a serious question mark over democracy in the United States. This term, I'm having trouble convincing any of the students that there's anything democratic left about the United States. There's been a real shift in perception. The debate has really picked up in the United States over the last few years, and the question really is, how much of a democracy are we, and how much of an oligarchy are we? And I think maybe the starting point is that, strangely, we are both. If we start back at the beginning of the 20th century, It's very clear that the United States has in many ways become more democratic. Women got the vote, we had a civil rights movement for African Americans, and yet at the same time, wealth inequality has skyrocketed over the exact same period. And so the question we confront today is, how can we have so much equality coexisting with so much inequality? And that becomes especially salient when we understand that wealth is a form of power.
The most visible manifestation of that wealth power is in the United States' glossy political campaigns. A staggering $3.7 billion was spent on the recent midterm elections. Campaign financing used to be more tightly controlled, until a pivotal Supreme Court ruling in 2010.
For a long period of time, there had been efforts in Congress to try to limit how much individuals and organizations could spend. And a case came before the Supreme Court that challenged the fundamental idea that you could limit spending because if you limited spending, you were limiting free speech.
On Capitol Hill, Senator Elizabeth Warren is one of the many politicians who expressed her anger.
Well-financed individuals and corporate interests are lined up to fight for their own privileges and to resist any change that would limit their special deals. The United States Supreme Court is doing all it can to help them.
That Supreme Court decision, Citizens United versus Federal Election Commission, unleashed unprecedented outside spending in the subsequent election cycles. 2 years after the ruling, in 2012, election spending levels tripled. Citizens United spawned the creation of super PACs, which accept unlimited contributions from corporations, unions, and individuals. For instance, one man, a liberal hedge fund manager, has funneled more than $73 million into campaigns this year, and he's not alone. Jeffrey Winters told me that in most campaigns at both national and state level, roughly 85% of all money is funded by less than 0.5% of the American population. And he says the issue goes deeper and becomes less transparent.
If you are someone who has a political agenda or a set of ideas that the wealthiest Americans don't like, you will not be viable as a political candidate.
In the US, party candidates are selected through what are called primaries. But according to Jeffrey Winters, before any voter gets to register their preference in a primary, there is what he calls a wealth primary, a pre-selection overseen by a small group of very rich Americans.
The wealth primary is unseen. It's behind closed doors, it's private meetings, it's in people's homes sometimes. By the time an American gets to vote on candidates, the spectrum of issues, the agenda has been narrowed and vetted to the point where the wealthiest are content with where things are going.
Jeffrey Winters believes this wealthy minority who influence government on behalf of the majority make sure they are virtually untouchable.
This is a moment right now when oligarchic power is probably at its greatest in U.S. history.
So where does that leave American democracy?
Oh, I think it's profoundly broken.
You're listening to The Inquiry on the BBC World Service. I'm Tessa Dunlop, and this week we're asking, is American democracy broken? Our first two witnesses have identified dysfunction right at the heart of the American system. But probe amidst the innards of most working democracies, and the view is likely to be murky. Sometimes it pays to take a step back. Our next witness evaluates American democracy from the other side of the Atlantic.
Part 3. The View from the Outside.
It's definitely a democracy compared to China or compared to Putin's Russia. And what makes it a democracy is that politicians are subject to severe scrutiny. There's a free press. There's robust freedom of information.
David Runciman is a professor of politics at Cambridge University.
But the other thing that a democracy needs is collective decision-making and public opinion shaping what politicians do so that they feel a connection between their choices and political choices. And that's what's eroding in America. Now, I'm in my 40s, I'll call it mid-40s, mid to late 40s. So I've grown up in the age of American power and American influence, both at its peak and now I think I'm watching the decline. 10, 20, 30 years down the line, the idea that it's always better in America, there's always a bright, confident tomorrow, it's harder to see that bright, confident tomorrow than it was even 20 years ago.
But isn't America still held up as the great blueprint of all democracies?
It's always been the kind of showroom model for democracy right back to the beginning. For more than 200 years, in a way, when people wanted to know about the state of democracy, they've looked at America first. It's where the good news is coming from, it's where the bad news is coming from. And at the moment, it looks like it's where the bad news is coming from. But over that 200-year story, it's been around for long enough now that there is a sense in some parts of the world that it's time to start looking in other places. I don't think it's the case that if American democracy goes wrong, everyone else believes that democracy has gone wrong. There are lots of other ways of doing democracy. But if American democracy goes wrong, it certainly makes the rest of the world extremely uncomfortable to know where to look for leadership.
According to David Runciman, gridlock is baked into the US system of government, but has never been more prevalent than it is today.
There is more partisanship. There is more talking past each other. There's more appealing to separate electorates, not to some common electorate. General elections aren't really general elections anymore in America. They're elections, in some senses, between two different countries. There's Republican land and there's Democratic land. So it's not unprecedented to have a divided government. I think what's unprecedented is just the lack of common ground between the people who have to try and make this system work. And the idea that this is a democracy in which, when the people have had enough, they can kick their rulers out. It doesn't work if the people are so divided on what it is that they've had enough about.
A system so divided it's difficult to kick out the rulers. Where does that leave America's democracy?
There is a long history here. So American democracy has, in a sense, the longest history of any democracy. So there's a lot to draw on. But we don't really know what happens when a democracy like America is today. So it's stable, it's old, it's prosperous. What happens to societies like that when their democracies stop working? And one possibility is they just stumble on, they muddle on. On the other side, that's a worrying prospect. The thought that this is something that just unravels little bit by little bit. So there's never a moment when either the people or the politicians, or ideally both, wake up to the fact they have to do something different. And if that's what the future is, then we really don't know what happens next, because we don't know what a very, very slow unravelling of a democracy looks like. We only really know historically what happens when they fall apart. America's not falling apart, but its democracy is very slowly decaying.
However, democracy is a relative concept, and perhaps recent history has over-egged American democratic credentials. Our last witness is keen to reframe our whole inquiry.
Part 4. The Republic.
When you look at the original intent of the founders, it was that America would be a republic and not, per se, a straight democracy.
Drew Ryan directs one of those PACs, political action committees, we were talking about earlier. His is called the Madison Project and is involved in numerous primary elections in the United States, with the goal of getting more people with conservative values elected to Washington, D.C. For him, it is a strength, not a weakness, that the American system isn't wholly democratic. It's a system he believes is worth fighting for.
Nothing worth having comes easy. I firmly believe that. My dad held 5 world records, a couple in the mile, and he ran in 3 Olympics. And that was something that was drilled inside of my head growing up, that nothing worth having comes easy. I would say from my perspective that unfortunately America is becoming more democratic, and I know that may throw some of your listeners for a little bit of a loop there, but I think if you were to go back and look at American history, you look at the founders, they had an opportunity to go with a pure Greek-type democracy, and that is every citizen of Athens at that point would have a direct vote. They wanted to avoid that at all costs. When you have a popular vote, you also have the danger of a majority that continues to dictate to the minority what can and can't be done. And I think a prime example of how a republic works is when you look at the balance of powers that happened in the 1960s, when you had the judiciary step in and empower the minorities and take away a lot of the impediments of the African American community, you saw, in a sense, how a republic works. If it had been left up to the majority and direct votes and how a pure democracy would work, I think America would be in a dramatically different place today than where we are based on how the judiciary branch acted in the 1960s. And I think that is a direct correlation to how a republic works and the balance of powers and again, free democracy and people get to vote, and yet how the government was structured by the founders to begin with. And I think it played out beautifully, and I think that's why we are where we are today as a nation.
The problem then isn't a contemporary crisis for democracy, but quite the reverse.
Rather than not having enough democracy, I would say that we're heading in the opposite direction, that maybe we have a little bit too much of it. When you look at the direct election of U.S. senators with the 17th Amendment, taking, in a sense, that out of state legislative hands and putting it to direct election, I think you saw what I would consider a little bit more of an eroding of what the founders intended, and that was that you would have elected officials that would make more of the decisions for you instead of a direct democracy. I think we are very close to the system being paralyzed in a sense by itself. We are dangerously slipping away from being a republic.
So, paralysis. A democracy in need of discipline. A profoundly broken system. There is consensus. But perhaps it's worth bearing in mind that the current immigration standoff revolves around 11 million people who have chosen to move to the United States of America no matter what. For the time being, the American democratic dream lives on.
This edition of The Inquiry was produced in London by Gemma Newby. We want to know what you want to know, so demand an inquiry. Get in touch via the World Service Facebook page or on Twitter at BBC The Inquiry. The program is also available as a free podcast.